what I thought I'd do is, by way of introduction, just give you a little bit of background to the review. As you can see, we've got 6 speakers here. Angus Deaton. Angus is chairing this review for the Institute, and got John van Reenen, who's going to talk about firms and inequality. John is writing, as I describe, is writing one of the studies for the review. I'll give you a little bit of background how it all fits together in a minute. Margaret Levi, who some of you will know, but Margaret's a political scientist from Stanford, and she'll be writing on this topic for the review with Tim Besley. Orazio Attanasio, working on early education and one of the panel members of the review. Stefanie Stantcheva, doing many, many great things around the field of inequality, and she's going to be telling us about her work on perceptions of inequality. And if time permits, I'll round up a little bit on the inequality in the labor market. But let me give you a little bit of background to what this is about. This, you could say, Robert Moffat was just saying, is this the US launch of the IFS Deaton Review? In some ways it is, although we've already been going for nearly 12 months. And it's a 5-year program of work that we set about trying to bring together the best available evidence across the social sciences to answer some big questions in inequality. We think it's quite unique in its breadth and depth, but of course there are many, many other studies going on of this kind, and we hope to kind of be just part of this and thinking about it very complementary to the kind of work, for example, that the Peterson Institute has done recently, Danny Roderick and Olivier Blanchard, and similar work at PSE and other institutions. So we're interested in a broad set of inequalities rather than inequality itself, which matter, how different kinds of inequality related, particularly what are the underlying driving forces that come together to create them, and in a way what we'd like to end up with is an idea of the best policies to tackle the adverse impacts of inequality or adverse inequalities. We could have covered just about all countries in a way. We decided to focus on developed economies, with the UK as a running example, and it's a good running example, somewhere between the US and other parts of Europe, and just trying to figure out how it fits, and what we're learning from all those different economies is the way we think about this. So comparative in nature, but also a focus on the UK, and not just about income inequality. I'm sure we'll see more of this, about a whole broad range of inequalities, including inequality of political voice, inequality across geography and space, and inequalities between places, space, generations, ethnicity, gender. So a really huge agenda in some ways. And the focus is on understanding the drivers of these inequalities and trying to get an idea of what will be the best policy mix. We kind of think of policies of being rather directed in particular areas, and we feel there's room here for getting some general form here. It's a big international panel we've put together for this, with Angus in the chair, thanks Angus, and a broad set of people. A lot of course, my IFS or connected IFS colleagues like Orazio here, but people also from many other disciplines. Lisa Berkman, who's epidemiologist from Harvard, Tim, of course, of political economy, Penny for her work on trade. There's Kath Kiernan, who's a sociologist of the family based in the UK. There's Lucinda Platt, who works on the sociology of ethnic differences. She's based at LSE. There's Deborah Satz, who some of you may know from philosophy department in Stanford. And there's Jean Tirole, emphasizing what we feel is very important to get an idea of where markets are working, what's new, what's happening in markets that may be creating or interacting with inequality. It's much like what we did 10 years ago, in fact, with the Murley's review of tax reform. This is broader and bigger, somewhat harder to handle perhaps, but exciting. It's in following that idea, it's going to be put together in 2 big volumes, which will probably be more internet-based than volumes themselves, but they will be volumes. The set of commission studies, which we're underway with, and you'll get a flavor for that. And then together with a set of commentaries, which are different aspects, different perspectives on those fields, and then a book written with Angus heading it up, the panel kind of taking an assessment of where we are. It's a 5-year program, so we've got 4 to go. That seems a long time, but we've set ourselves a lot here. At the same time, we're bringing country studies, so we've had a huge interest, especially around Scandinavia and the rest of Europe, in trying to do similar things, at least descriptively. And we'll have a set of country studies which are just starting off now. The kind of commission studies, this is the set of commission studies. I've highlighted ones just to give you an idea of the breadth, and also highlighted the ones in red that relate to what we'll be discussing here. There are gaps in what we discussed today, of course, and don't worry, we're trying to cover that ground as well, but you can see that the why inequality, what inequality, the political economy, the attitudes, specifically inequalities and their relation to health, family dynamics, early childhood development, labor markets, taxes and transfers, firms and market power. And the idea here is that maybe we can get a feeling for how policies across these fields might interact. And so let's begin the main part of the session and invite Angus up here to give the first talk. I'm going to stay up here and kind of coordinate things on the screen, if I can do that. But the others will stay down there because it's easier to see.
Thank you, Richard.
Angus, do you want to sit down?
Okay. Thanks very much. Whenever I hear the words Deaton Review, I get very nervous. It sounds like it's me that's being reviewed, and it's sort of like I'm up for tenure review or something. The other thing you'll notice about the previous 2 reviews with Mead and Murley's, neither of them is with us anymore. So I hope that's not some sort of prediction by Richard. So this I called Inequality, Why Do We Care? And I put at least, why do I care? As Richard emphasized, this is an ongoing study, and it would be quite presumptuous of me to talk about anything today that pre-commits that study. I mean, one of the great things about sitting here and watching this work come in is I get to learn a tremendous amount, and I change my mind on a regular basis. So what I want to talk about today is some of the things I've been thinking about in this context, but it is very personal, and it's not the results of the review. So here is a discussion which I made up. It's not a real discussion, but all the bits of it are real enough. So here's a concerned friend who says, I worry about inequality, that it's getting worse and worse, that it's somehow tearing us apart, that society has become less fair. I hear that the very existence of billionaires is wrong. I've even heard that inequality is responsible for Brexit and for Donald Trump, even that people are not living as long. Is that right? So then an unconcerned economist responds something like as follows. Don't worry so much. There's a lot of hysteria out there, much of it hyped up by the left. The way we measure inequality is using something called the Gini coefficient. While it is true that it rose quite quickly when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, it has actually been flat or falling for the last 30 years. The US is a good deal more unequal than Britain, but even here, the Gini has hardly moved since the financial crisis. So it can't have much to do with Mr. Trump. It really is yesterday's problem. So this shows somehow the incredible incomprehension between economists and the rest of the population. And, you know, this statement is correct, but entirely unhelpful. Often that joke is made about accountants. You know, they tell you something and it's dead true, but it's completely useless. It does not address the serious content of the question, which is the sort of question that I think really is troubling people. And the question is a perfectly reasonable one that captures well the sort of concerns that people have about inequality. And the IFS review will try to do a better job of providing an answer. Maybe we will get this answer. There really isn't a problem. I doubt it. But it's, everything's open here. Just so you can see, here's the Gini coefficient. This comes from the Census Bureau. You can see there's nothing until the 70s. There's a very rapid increase. The most rapid increase is almost certainly measurement error when they changed and top coding and various other technical details. There used to be, the Census Bureau used to publish that graph with a gap in it. It doesn't anymore, so maybe it thinks it wasn't a problem. And then you get this slow growth for a while, but remember this is long scale, so since the financial crisis, it's really been pretty flat. Here is also the similar graph for the UK, which has the 90-10 ratio too. One of the things that really is extraordinary about this graph is that increase in the green line at the bottom, the Gini coefficient, is almost precisely from the day she arrived to the day she departed of Mrs. Thatcher's premiership. And then since then, there's been very little, and you hear these claims that the Gini really hasn't changed much or has even fallen in the last 30 years. So I've been thinking about, why do we pay so much attention to this guy Gini, or this coefficient? I don't know how many of you know anything about Mr. Gini. Orazio is nodding, so he knows what I'm going to say. He was a sociologist, a demographer, and a statistician, and did very distinguished work in all of these fields. He wrote a book in Italian in 1912 with an analysis of the Gini coefficient, and it has a lot of really good stuff in it. Not only that, but he did work on purchasing par parity exchange rates, which is not what we're talking about today, but just to show you the breadth. But we still use his method in calculating price indices, transitive price indices across countries. The Gini coefficient came into the English language in some sense. The Gini wrote a comment on Hugh Dalton's famous 1920 paper, the one that's about the principle of transfers and how to measure inequality. It's very much a direct predecessor of Tony Atkinson's 1970 paper on the measurement of inequality. And also this idea of measuring the rate inequality by the ratio of what was possible to what's actually being achieved, and enunciating the principle of transfers. And Gini's coefficient was in the Economic Journal in 1921. Dalton, of course, is a very interesting figure. As any of you who are British will know, he became Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Labour government in 1945. So he actually had some opportunity to use his principle of transfers. Gini was a different kettle of fish altogether. He was a eugenicist, he was a racist. He wrote long papers in defense of fascism, which were published in top American political science journals. Harvard gave him an honorary degree in 1936. At the time he was writing defenses of fascism. He was a very rabid colonialist who urged Italy to invade Ethiopia as an outlet for his eugenicist policies. He was head of ESTAT, which is still the Italian statistical office, and he met Mussolini twice a week for many years to advise him on policy and the gathering of data. After World War II, perhaps somewhat chastened, he argued that America should take over the rich countries of the world and establish a I also wanted to tell you a story that Franco Modigliani once told me. Franco, many of you are young here, so you may not know who Franco was, but he was a very, very great economist of the second half of the 20th century. He was Jewish, and he fled from Italy in 1939 after he defended his PhD thesis. And at a later conference, he met Gini, and Gini was very keen to make it clear who was the important person at this conference. And he took off his watch and he gave it to Franco Modigliani and said, "My watch is broken, please see that it's fixed by the end of the conference." Well, I don't think Gini was interested in measuring inequality, but he was interested in measuring dispersion. As far as I can see, he had no interest in social welfare or any part of this at all. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way, am I? I'm clearly going very much the wrong way. Okay. So Deborah Satz is not here, but I wanted to say a few things about what philosophers say. Philosophers are pretty universally concerned with deprivation or poverty and would maintain our duty to assist those in poverty. They're much less concerned with equality, makes that case pretty compellingly. Of course, that's not the instrumental effects of inequality. You might use your wealth to harm me in some way, but that's a possible, not inherent problem of inequality. Maybe it is inherent, but there are other ways of stopping people who are very rich from doing you harm. You could have rules like antitrust rules, for instance, things like that, which might prevent that happening. Prioritarians, which is really Dalton, Atkinson, and later Derek Parfit, see a virtue in equality in of itself. That's essentially the principle of transfers, and they recognize that people will not work or invest or innovate if equality is guaranteed, so they work out the policy that balances the two. Would like some efficiency too, and so there's an optimal tax schedule. Some egalitarians will go so far as to value equality even if it violates the Pareto principle. And in fact, I don't know how many of you read Sayers and Zuckman's new book, where they have a chapter called Going Beyond Laffer, which argues that it would be desirable to destroy pre-tax income at the top in order to diminish inequality.
It's in GDP, so the labour share has gone down over this period. And also, and this is a more controversial thing because this is much harder to measure, but the markups of prices over marginal cost, the aggregate price-cost margin, also appears to have increased over this period. So, I'm just walk you through a few of those findings. So, the easiest way to kind of measure size is just in terms of jobs. So, if we just go to the kind of population of employer firms in the US and look at the fraction of people working in large firms, superstar firms or mega firms, I just defined it here in this slide as a big firm is one where there's more than 5,000 employees. So there's about 5.2 million employer firms in the US, and there's only about 2,400 firms bigger than 5,000 employees. In the mid-1980s, those 5,000 firms accounted for about 28% of all jobs. So that's a pretty big fraction for like 0.03% of firms in the US economy. But by today, that fraction had increased to 34%, a 6 percentage point increase. So the amount of workers working for big firms has increased, very substantially over this period. Now, jobs are kind of an easy way to measure firm size, but I think they're an increasingly poor way of measuring firm size. If you think of the superstar firms, the mega firms of today, like the Googles and Facebooks, they employ relatively few people, given the size, the revenues that these firms create. So if you look at, say, sales, for example, of the top 500 firms in the US economy, that's tripled in aggregate since 1972, from about $4 trillion to $12 trillion. And although some of this is, some of the stuff might be to do with kind of oil prices, if you look at the non-oil sector, this relative to GDP is still a big increase of the importance of these firms. So that's just in terms of their overall size. Another way of measuring the importance of these firms would be relative to the industries which they operate in. So in the following graphs, and this is kind of joint work with David Alter, Larry Katz, Christina Patterson, and David Dawn, we went into the US Census. So in the census, you can get the population of all firms. And we looked at the relative size of each firm compared to its four-digit SIC industry. So a four-digit industry is it's relatively narrow, like, say, synthetic cement. Not as narrow as you might like for a 2IO market, but this is the kind of most narrow thing that you can get. It's about 700 or 800 industries in the US that we looked at over this period of time, accounting for the bulk of sales. Then if you do that at these kind of relatively narrow industries and look at measures of concentration, which I've shown you broken down by the 6 main segments of the US census, then you can see there's a very dramatic increase in concentration no matter how you look. So say you take manufacturing, for example, the top left, this blue line is the fraction of total sales in the industry going to the top 4 firms. That's increased. The lower lines are employment. So although employment is less concentrated than sales, no matter where you look, you see this increase of industrial concentration over the past 30 or 40 years. So it's a pretty dramatic change that we've seen in terms of concentration rates over this time period. And that calls out for an explanation, if nothing else. So that's in terms of size. What about in terms of productivity? So there's different ways to measure productivity. Here's the most simple way, which is just the ratio of sales to employment, kind of labor productivity. And this draws on the work of John Halterwanger, who's shown that this is the manufacturing, but you see this in other sectors as well, that there's been an increase of the variance of productivity across firms over time, almost, again, no matter how you measure it. These are several different data sources, but they all show the same pattern, that firms look increasingly different in terms of their productivity levels. Finally, let's look at wages. So we know that wage inequality has increased a lot. So what we have here, this is taken from work by Song and others in the QJ this year. Along the horizontal axis is the kind of percentile, and we look at the change between 1981 and 2013 for different percentiles of the distribution. So the blue line, which is kind of the kind of individual wage inequality, which we all know, very big increases for the rich in the income distribution, very little increases of real wages for the relatively poor. The other line, this is the average wages in firms. So that's kind of average wage inequality has gone up more or less at the same rate as individual inequality. This green line at the bottom is inequality within firms. So the difference between wages for workers within firms. And this has remained, apart from CEOs, who are the richest people, the top 1%, has remained pretty flat. So what this is saying is that the overall increase of inequality between individuals is really a between-firm phenomena rather than a within-firm phenomena. And, sometimes it's described as the kind of McDonald's and McKinsey effect, where increasingly low-wage workers are working together in the same firms like McDonald's, and increasingly high-wage workers are working in the same firm like McKinsey. So there's been this bifurcation of the market, which has happened particularly between firms. Okay, so that's what's happened overall in terms of firm inequality. What about in terms of the kind of more macroeconomic outcomes? Well, this would be well known to most of you that if you look at the labour share of GDP, which I learned when I was doing macro should stay stable over time, has actually declined quite a lot over the last 30 years. So the share of GDP going to workers has actually declined in the US over this period, particularly in the 2000s. The final thing here on the aggregate change is what's happened to markups. And markups are much harder to measure. You can do this in various ways. This is taken from some work by Jan de Lockyer and co-authors from US CompuStat firms, where they try and estimate what's happened to the markup. And they found a very big increase of the price-cost margin for firms over time, up from something like 20% in 1980 up to about 60% by the end of the period. So there's lots of issues of measurement over this. You might be worried, these are only stock market listed firms. This is the worldwide accounts. But if you look in the US Census again, which again has all firms, doesn't have the same selection problems, and you try and estimate markups, you actually see a kind of similar pattern. So this top line here again is the weighted average markup. And you can see these are different estimation techniques. Just look at this one to begin with. You can see the aggregate markup again has increased, even with this other data source. This is just for manufacturing, but in a similar way to what Locotel were estimating across CompuStat. The lower lines are kind of interesting. So this is the aggregate change, the weighted average markup. This is what's happened to the median and the unweighted average. So you can see that for the typical firm in the US economy, there's hardly been any change in this estimated markup. what's really happening is at the top of the distribution. And part of this is the firms at the top getting higher markups, but most of this actually is to do with the way that reallocation is taking place. So more and more output is going towards high markup firms in the way that low labor share firms, which is the flip side of the markup actually. For stable technology, the labor share is a pretty good measure, inverse measure of the markup. What's happening is more and more of the weight of the economy is moving towards these high markup, low labor share, more productive firms. This reallocation effect is a really important factor in what's going on. Okay, so what are the kind of links between these business trends and overall inequality? Well, there's lots of different ways we could think of that. One is that, as we've argued in the paper with Orta, that the rise of these superstar firms, this increase of concentration, helps explain the fall of labour and GDP. So because these large firms have lower labour shares, as more output shifts towards these firms, concentration rises. And that tends to reduce the overall share, the labour share of GDP because of this reallocation effect. And because most of the income that people get is through labour income rather than capital income, this is a force for increasing inequality between people because of the relative falling importance of labour, as Piketty has argued. A second connection is, well, if these trends do reflect lower product market competition, this is also likely to have an effect on lower productivity growth and therefore to be associated with lower wage growth, which may be one of the key things driving the growth of populism that Angus has mentioned. Now, I will say, whether this all reflects a fall of competition, I'll mention briefly on the next slide. It's not obvious it's all reflects that. But even if there's no change in competition, there could still be a concern with firm size per se. If these firms are very large, maybe they spend more on lobbying, maybe they change the rules of the game. That's a concern we might have independently of whether this reflects market power per se. Fourthly, we might be concerned about monopsony. These firms may have more power if they're larger over their suppliers, in particular the suppliers of labour. And that may have an impact on lowering wages. It also may have an impact on the suppliers being worse off. The relationship between these firm inequality as individuals is a complex thing. So this is part of what we're trying to unravel, but I think potentially it's very important to understand these in terms of linking with overall inequality. So why have these trends happened? I don't think anybody knows for sure, but here's four main factors, I think, which are important to thinking about this. So one story is it could just be weaker antitrust enforcement. And this is the kind of Philippon argument. The regulators have been asleep at the wheel. They've allowed too much anti-competitive practices to occur, and this is lying behind these trends. A second story is to do with what's happening with the high-tech industries. So as platform competitions become more important, as network effects become more important, this leads to this kind of winner-take-all phenomena, which could be driving what happens. However, as we've seen, these trends of concentration haven't just happened in the high-tech industries. They've also been happening in, say, lower-tech industries. So I think you have to go beyond the kind of network effect story. So think about Walmart. So Walmart has made these enormous hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars of investment in software, which enables it to move around goods around the US through its logistic network and also manage its inventory on a just-in-time basis. Those types of investments are impossible to make for smaller firms and smaller chains. So this is an example where an increase of fixed costs in this form of intangible capital has meant that these large firms have a scale advantage. These investments, maybe the high markups have to be there in order to pay for these sunk cost investments. So that's another kind of story which might be going on in some sectors. Finally, globalization and increases in competition, increasing internet price comparisons, can also be a force for increasing concentration as well. So I think that this, many manufacturing sectors hit by this blast of competition with China and elsewhere is a kind of factor. The key policy point, I think, in all of this is that even if we think firms have become dominant through competing on the merits, then it doesn't mean that they will continue to do so in the future, as Angus has emphasized, that maybe the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons got there through competing on the merits, but there is always a risk now they are so powerful they can use that power to make things worse for consumers and workers. So I think there's a lot of work which has to be around the modernization of antitrust rules. So John Sherroll, myself, and a number of other people are working on this as part of the review to think of how we can improve the competition policy in order to deliver better outcomes for people. Are these trends all US specific? This is an active area of research. My sense here is that these changes are not just US specific. We see these in many different countries, which makes me think the failure to enforce antitrust rules or institutions isn't the main story going on. I certainly believe it's true in some sectors, like in healthcare and hospitals. I agree with Angus. Also, maybe telecoms and airlines. There is a strong case for insufficient antitrust enforcement. But in Europe, for example, we see many of the same trends as we do in the US. So this is taken from OECD work, which is also using the same type of census data I showed you from the US. We see the same kind of increase of concentration as we saw in the US over the kind of time period from the 2000s. So it does look like many of the same trends we see in the US we also see in other countries. This is part of the work which we want to do as part of the Deaton review to kind of show this. Same thing with labour share. This is the 4 biggest economies in the world. They've also had a fall of the labour share. If you look at price-cost margins, again, with the caveats, these also seem to have increased in Europe as well as North America, Asia, and Oceania. So, in conclusion, I do think there are these very dramatic changes which have happened in the industrial landscape in the US and the developed countries. We've seen this increase in inequality in size, productivity and wages, and probably an increase of aggregate markups. There's many links between this firm inequality disparities of inequality between people, and I think there's still an issue of how we understand this. So in terms of understanding these trends, one view is there's a macro story which kind of explains all of these. My personal view is there's probably different things happening in different industries, so we actually need to drill down to specific industries to understand what's happening in order to figure this out. But that's very much what we want to do in the review, and policy response has to be built on the outcomes of this type of analysis. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Fantastic. So we're not taking questions as we go along. This is being videoed, and if we get time at the end, we'll have some questions. But on the website, Deaton Review website, we'll have a kind of place for comments and questions, and that'll be an active place for debate as well. So, Margaret, fantastic. Let me just get this. Which one was it? What's the part? Yeah, that's the one. Great. Thank you.
I don't see anything up there. Okay.
Great.
All right. So I'm going to talk about political inequality and how we start to rethink that set of issues. And I'm doing this with Tim Besley and with Pablo Beramendi, and I have to tell you that we've only started working on this, so we don't have lots of papers to report on or data to present. And I also should tell you that I'm not the formal modeler in the group, though we will be working towards developing something of a model and also hopefully some kind of version of an index of political inequality that will not be a Gini coefficient, particularly after what I've just learned. Okay, so these are the things that we'll be covering in the review and in our piece, and I'm going to go over each of them in a little more detail. I didn't think I would give you lots to read, rather I'd have you sort of more listen to me. And you'll just see the topics there. So the first thing we want to do is to, sorry, didn't mean to. So the first thing we want to do is to really think about the historical context in which all of this is happening. And you've already heard some of those issues already. So we've seen a huge growth in the state and democracy from the late 19th to the mid-20th century or late 20th century. Increased state intervention in people's lives through the development of the welfare state, though that's been variable in the forms it's taken and the intensity that it's had, depending on the country and even the time. Changes in an increase in labor protections, universal education, infrastructural provision. These are all state interventions, including regulation of markets and various new forms of international trade and development. We've also seen an immense spread of democratization and an increase in the franchise, even in those countries for which started the democracy process. Sorry, you don't want to do that yet. Okay, the second issue that we're going to be addressing is some of the changes since the 1980s, clearly a crucial period, as Angus emphasized in his talk, and as was revealed to some extent even in John's statistics. Since the 1980s, there have been general but not universal changes in all of those things that I talked about in terms of the intervention of the state, in part because there's been a reduction in state intervention, as there's an increasing emphasis on monetarist and supply side rather than fiscal policies, the end of the Cold War with resulting international realignments, a decline in labor union and weakening of labor parties, which have had a huge consequence, we're going to argue, on political equality, a more general access to digital technology and communication tools, as well as the rise of social media, which give a different kind of voice to a different kind of groups of people than we've seen in the past. And that's, I think, an important issue we're going to have to address. We've also seen new kinds of threats. The existential threat of climate change, which has been there, but we're beginning finally a little bit to recognize it. The international refugee crisis, which is a very different kind of refugee crisis than those of the past. And the rise of alternative models. We're no longer in the Cold War, but we now are in a war, as it were, with China, not only about trade, but also a very different model of how to provide social services and social well-being to people. Different trade-offs when you think about China than a country like the U.S. China did, after all, raise most of its people out of poverty, billions of people. Okay, we're also, one of our major emphases here, and one of the things I'm going to conclude with, is how all this affects the social contract, an argument that both Tim and I feel strongly about, that what we've had in the past, and it's emerged, it's changed, it's been renegotiated at different times, but we've had a kind of social contract that has existed between government and citizens, what the quid pro quo, excuse my language in this time of Trump impeachment, but the quid pro quo between government and citizens, what each expects from the other in terms of services and obligations. There's been a contract implied, rather than as explicit, between the wealthy and the non-wealthy, between those with considerable social and educational advantage and those without, between employers and employees. The consequences of that deterioration of the social contract is partially an explanation, I would argue, of the rise of the kind of nativist populisms that we're seeing all over, the rise of green parties on the other side of that equation, but more importantly, the loss of common values and culture and kind of identity, and a reduction in what I've called elsewhere quasi-voluntary compliance, or the kind of compliance and consent that citizens give to government when they believe they're getting something of what they should be getting. The quasi part refers to there is coercive backup when you're talking about the state, so it's quasi-voluntary compliance. So the first question we really have to address then is, how does economic inequality affect political inequality? And then we're going to think about the other side of that. We know that there's been growing economic advantage and influence outside the democratic process in many countries, through money, education, and access to information, among many other variables. We also know that there have been changes or failure to change certain rules within the democratic process that then amplify the transformation of economic inequality into political inequality. So the elite bias in the election of the political class has always been there to some extent, but it's taking different, and if one might argue, more problematic forms. There's a lack of responsiveness in many countries to democratic mandates. There's vote and voice suppression. And there's changes in the relationship between labor and employers with all kinds of consequences. There are some counterbalances to that. They're numbers. The votes of the lower income percentile can still matter. They can be quite pivotal in various elections. They still outnumber the rich. So when votes actually matter and when there's sufficient turnout, the numbers can actually have an effect. There's public opinion, and research shows that it matters even when people aren't turning out to vote, and we'll refer to some of that research as we do the report. There's rules of representation that give voice, unequal voice, to the non-rich, or give possibilities of voice to the non-rich. I've already mentioned social media, which is clearly having some consequences. And there's an inequality mobility link that raises income and the standard of living globally, which is a counterbalance to that economic inequality. So the question then is, how does political inequality affect economic inequality? And the good news is that we now have some data that might be useful in answering some of these questions, though I don't have the data at hand right now. Hopefully we're going to be able to put that together. The first thing to say is that we have what I would call two faces of power. This is from an old literature in political science. It starts with Robert Dahl and probably before him. And the first face of power really has to do with the fact that you can get someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, right? You can compel them, you can force them, you can induce them, but they wouldn't have otherwise done it. And when we think about that in terms of what kinds of institutional arrangements and other mechanisms are going on within the political sphere that are affected by the economic sphere, the eligibility for suffrage is one of those. Electoral rules, seniority, legal rights, spray protests, demonstrations, freedom of speech. Then there's a second dimension of power, which is really getting people aren't even able to think or express what they want to express. They don't have the possibility to express that voice. They're not being compelled to do something they don't want to do. They don't have the opportunity to do what they do want to do. And here, voter suppression is clearly an important thing. Bias and discrimination. A lot of the argument about this really came out of thinking about the effect of the rules in the South, in the United States, that made it impossible for people of color, even when they legally had the right to vote, to express that right to vote, or to speak up in legislatures, or to lobby, or to engage in all forms of collective action and demonstrations. And all of this together really affects the civic culture, which is going to be a crucial part of our story about how preferences get developed and how an idea of what you want the polity to be and what the norms of fairness and equity are likely to be. Okay. So, what we want to think about here are changes in the time and place, in the demands and preferences for redistribution, as expressed through voting and collective mobilization. We want to understand why those have changed over time and place. We want to understand the variation in government institutions and policies that support political and economic inequality, the change in political and economic quality over time. We're going to let others do most of the change in economic inequality, and then how that relates to the development of the social contract. What we're not going to do is the normal way of going about this by political scientists and political economists, which is to use the median voter schema. Its major empirical implications are false. It leaves out partisanship, multiple other dimensions of preferences, institutions, and political and economic power. Instead, we're going to start with a model that looks more like this, which thinks about citizens' preferences over dimension, and there are multiple dimensions in politics, another problem with the median voter model, which tends to just have two dimensions. How those citizen preferences over dimension then affect and are affected by political institutions, which leads to what kinds of political parties are developed, which leads to economic institutions and political institutions of political involvement was that second thing, how the citizens' preferences affect political involvement. Then political parties affect the political institutions, which then affect policy, which then affects both labor market income and the distribution of disposable income. And this comes back to affect citizen preferences. Now, this is a model that one of the co-authors, Pablo Beramendi, helped to develop, but it's very much based on the Swedish or social democratic model. And so one of the things we need to do is think really hard whether that's really a model we want to inject into the rest of the world in quite this form. Now, we do know that preferences change. And here we see just some slides that Tim Besley put together, trying to figure out what people, using the World Value Study and the European Value Study, using quite a few respondents in 1981 to 2014. And we can see that there are generational differences, educational differences, and yet preferences are stable across generations and heterogeneous by countries over the question, do you think that incomes should be made more equal? At the same time, we find that less equal countries have weaker preferences for equality. And this is a general finding in a lot of literature, not just these particular studies. So that's a dilemma that we're going to have to deal with. Here's some data that Thomas Piketty has recently put together in his argument that he's making about the Brahmin left versus the merchant right and the divisions within the upper class or the richer classes. And he's showing the differences in and how there's been a change in voting for left-wing and democratic parties in France, Britain, and the US. His findings are not unique to him, but this is a nice set of graphs because it at least compares 3 countries. We also see that political participation has declined in all of these countries, particularly among the lower income. Okay, that leads us to the next set of issues that we need to address. We know that preferences and popular demands can change, and there are a lot of different factors that influence that. This is just a laundry list of those factors. Institutions matter, ideas and leadership matter, economic geography matters, policy matters, popular organization and collective action have a huge influence on it, and culture and values matter. So what are we going to do given that preferences and popular demands can change? How do we begin to create a new kind of social contract? And how do we create a set of preferences for whether it be equality per se or fairness in the way that Angus was talking about? Well, there are some government levers of change towards equality. We know that fiscal policy, taxes and transfers, regulations of a variety of kinds can have an influence. Pre-distribution and social investment are things that we're going to be looking very closely at. And equally importantly, we're going to be looking at laws that facilitate democratic organizing and organizations. We know that one of the reasons that labor unions have declined, in part, is because of changes in the law, not just changes in workers' preferences. The workers' preferences stay high for having some kind of representation and voice, but the laws have made it harder to organize. It's harder to organize in a whole variety of other ways as well. Okay, so that leads us to what will be the conclusion here, that we need a new social contract. And that requires creating not only a new political equilibrium, which rebuilds confidence in government willingness and capacity to support political and economic equity, if not full equality. We need to build what my co-author and I, John Alquist, have called an encompassing community of fate, create a set and design a set of institutions that evoke from people a willingness to act even on behalf of far distant others who cannot directly reciprocate around common values and common sense of feeling obligations to each other, and to redesign the institutions that make both political equality and flourishing possible. That enables us to learn from comparison in history, one size will not fit all, so we have to think about particular countries and particular regions. And a capitalist democracy modified possibly may be the best, but not the only means to reach equity, fairness, and a new social contract. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Fantastic. Oh. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Today I'm going to talk mainly about another aspect of inequality that the review is going to study and analyze, which is the inequality of what we call in the panel human development, and try to understand when it happens, how it happens, and what consequence it has. This is a short outline of my presentation. So it should be clear from what Angus and Richard said before that the review will have many dimensions. And one of those, which is complementary and important, in my opinion, to the other parts of the review that look at firms, institutions, etc., is the study of inequality in human development, its drivers, and how it is changed in recent times. And we think this is important for several reasons. First, inequality in different types of skills might have changed in the population. The prevalence of different types of skills might have changed. The remuneration, the prices on the market that the skills get on the market might have changed, and the remuneration of different dimensions or different skills can be different. Inequality in human development can imply also access to many other aspects of well-being, ranging from health to political participation. And finally, we think that the inequality in human development might play an important role in creating vicious circles and leading to an intergenerational transmission of inequality and poverty. So let's start by looking at this issue of the different dimensions of human development. As economists, for a long time, we were used to focus on what we called human capital as a unidimensional object or factor of production that enters the production process and gets remuneration in the labor market. I think there is an increasing recognition that there are many dimensions to human capital. And these dimensions are important in the process of development, starting in the very early years. And they play different roles in the production process and command different remunerations. The evidence on the returns to different types of skills, however, is still quite limited. What I will do, partly because there are a number of measurement and data availability problems. What I will do, I'll provide now some examples of evidence on the importance of different types of skills. There is a paper by Heckman, Sixrud, and Orazio a number of years ago that looks at the returns on cognitive and what they call non-cognitive skills, and show that they are important determinants of wages, both for males and females. And this is true, the relevance of non-cognitive skills, how they're measured, they are relevant even after controlling for educational attainment. Moreover, as can be shown in this picture that has the quantiles of different cognitive and non-cognitive skills and log wages on the horizontal axis, on the vertical axis, there might be interactions and nonlinearities between complementarities or sustainabilities between different types of skills. There is a much more recent paper last year paper by Papa George, Ronda, and Zen, that using data from the British cohort study, they show that there are remuneration not just to cognition but also to socio-emotional skills, what they call externalizing behavior, like sociability, the ability to work with others and the like. And internalizing behavior could be drive, motivations, and the like, both in terms of hours and employment, and both for males and females, and they seem to be quite important even after controlling for educational attainment. We have a paper with Richard and other two co-authors where, using similar data, we show that even skills measures, what we call internalizing and externalizing skills, measured at age 11, have an impact on earnings at age 42, even for after controlling for cognitive abilities at 11. So the skills get formed early, and they seem to have a long-run effect. I would like to make a very short digression on issues of measurement. It's something that I've been thinking a fair amount of recently. Measures of different types of skills is very limited, partly because it's difficult, but partly because traditionally they have not been measured. Good quality longitudinal data are very few and far between. The British cohort data are an important exceptions, but they still have many conceptual issues. Measures change across cohorts and over time. The type of tests that are used to measure the children development and like has been changing quite a bit, which makes difficult to compare these different types of skills. It's not obvious what dimensions are relevant and what measures can capture them. So should we measure cognition? Should we measure sociability? And so on and so forth, and what measures are able to capture these latent factors. And finally, especially if one is interested in comparing across cohorts and over time, one has to establish a metric, fix an anchor to these measuring problems. It could be adult outcomes, but then you need really, if you start studying young children, you need to have very long longitudinal data, or try to find some way to around these problems. After this small digression, I would like to talk a little bit about inequality in certain skills and show some evidence that might have increased. And that could be an important driver of inequality in earnings. Another dimensions could be another dimension. There could be inequality in different types of skills. This is particularly relevant now when the return to these different skills might have been changing in the economy. There is evidence that the inequality in certain skills has changed, and I will provide an example, again taken from the paper that I have with Richard and Gabriella Conti and Giacomo Masson, that uses data from the British cohort study, which is a cohort born in 1970, and the Millennium cohort study born in 2000. I will focus on social-emotional skills identified with two factors, what we call the internalizing and externalizing skills. We haven't done cognition here in comparing because we have found very, very hard to compare the measures that are available in the two different cohort studies. And indeed, we find the comparability of the two cohorts in terms of means quite hard. And so we'll focus on comparing inequality, comparing variances between the two cohorts. So these are the four distributions for the two cohorts. The blue ones are the MCS, the red ones are the BCS, the 1970. And on the top panel is the externalizing skills. And the bottom panel are the internalizing skills, males and females. And you can see that there's been changes between the two cohorts. There seems to be more variability in the more recent cohorts. If you look at the skills by maternal background, so the children of families with compulsory educations are normalized to 0, and then the numbers on the right of the panel correspond to children with post-compulsory educations. So we measure the change, the difference between this, the effect of the socioeconomic status. And you can see that the increase in the MCS cohort is uniformly higher relative to the BCS cohort. So the importance of the socioeconomic status has increased both for males and females, and both for internalizing and externalizing skills. Now we can then move on to the intergenerational transmission on inequality. Inequality in skills starts very early. The intergenerational transmission in inequality is a direct consequence of this process. And there is growing evidence that what happens in the early years matters a fair amount. And it matters both in the process of skill accumulations. There are important dynamic complementarities between what happens in different periods of the life cycles. And it matters because it has long-term consequences. At the same time, on the positive side, because the early years appear so malleable, they are probably very relevant for policy, and I will refer at the end to this. Parenting has a key influence on human development, and as we'll see in a second, economic shocks and inequalities have relevance for parenting and therefore for children outcomes. These are the graphs. The next three graphs that I'll show are the first output that the group of researchers that are working on the chapter on the Deaton review part on the human development and the importance of the early years have recently produced. Is Alyssa Goodman and others. And so these are all data from the MCS. The first graph are the distribution for different degrees of different level of education of mothers for children, for two different factor of development for children 9 months old. And already at 9 months, you can see, especially in the bottom graph that measures adaptability, you can see some differences between the children of better educated mothers and less educated mothers. Those differences become very much pronounced at 3 years. These are the same kids that are observed over time. It's, again, the Millennium Cohort studies from Britain. And even more so at 5 years. At 3 years and 5 years, we know how to measure cognitions and social-emotional skills, and you can see this marked difference. So these gaps emerge very early. Moreover, they have long-run effects. This is now going back to the NCDS, which is the 1958 cohort, and the BCS, which is again the 1970, so the blue and the orange. And you can see the log wages at age 42 of cognition, externalizing, internalizing skills measured at 11 in these two cohorts. And you can see, that they have long-term impacts on a variety of outcomes ranging from wages to employment to health, both physical and mental health. And moreover, the impact that these skills have changed over time across the two cohorts. What is behind this? Probably many factors. One important one that we'll be studying extensively is the change in the structure of families. This is a simple graph that gives you an idea of the type of changes. So this is the percentage of 44 to 45 years old who are married or cohabitating by education. The orange line are the better educated, so the degree level qualifications, and the green line are below a degree level or no qualification. So you can see that since the early 90s, for the green group, for the less educated group, there has been a marked decline in people living in stable families, married or cohabitating, which is not the case for the better educated people. What happens to parents and what happens to family structures matter for children outcome. Again, here I will show some pictures taken from some evidence taken from a recent paper by Jackson, Kiernan, and McLanahan. Kat Kiernan is part of the panel and is working on families. And this shows the effect that negative shocks to economic circumstances and other factors can have on child development. So this is a first table that uses again data from the British MCS and shows that there are impacts of these trajectories. People experience income decline, so permanently low income. Their children have a slower development in a variety of outcomes, both even after controlling for education. And this is true for the UK and also for the US, which is the second table here. Finally, I think there is evidence, there are policies that seem to be effective. I do think in the red letters indicate policies that have been studied. And I think we know there are some interventions that work. I think the big challenge is to, try to fully understand how the policies that work, what generates the positive impacts. Second, how to construct scalable policies, which involves not just money and financial resources, but also the availability of infrastructure that is that allows you to implement at scale effective policies. And because many of these are interventions on parenting that aim at changing individual behaviors, you need to find a way to channel the appropriate messages, and which is not just money. You have to achieve ownership of these policies by communities, by families, and the like. I'm running out of time, so I'll leave the conclusions of this, which sketch some of the work that we aim to do within the review on human development. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I'm going to talk about not the reality of inequality, but rather the perceptions of it. And the way to understand these perceptions that people have, which may or may not be in line with reality, is to use what I like to call social economic surveys, which is a way to get into people's minds and understand what actually is going on there in terms of attitudes, perceptions, beliefs. So in a nutshell, what I want to tell you in this talk is that perceptions, not only reality, are actually key in shaping people's views on policies, in particular policies to address inequality. And social economic survey labs which is this new tool that we can use, large-scale online surveys and experiments that can be done in a very interactive, broad way, can really help us get into people's minds and understand these perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, basically these things which are completely intangible in other data sets. So I want to quickly go through five points. They're all going to be quite brief. First is just to give you a tiny overview about why this new tool, these social economic surveys, are so useful. And then I'll show you a range of perceptions that you may find interesting that address different aspects of inequality, mobility, redistribution. One is how the belief in the American dream, emphasis on belief rather than the reality of it, shapes our views on redistribution. Third, the belief about who actually benefits from redistribution and how we're perhaps misguided on that. And that will bring us to the issue of the misperceptions of immigrants and how much they benefit from redistribution. Then I'll talk about how worse news about inequality actually doesn't really increase demand for redistribution, perhaps one of the puzzles we see currently in the US, but actually decreases trust in the government. And then I'll finish with some quite brand new results about how people misunderstand and view actually tax policy as one of the major tools to address inequality. So without further ado, so what are these social economic surveys, this new tool? Well, some things are really invisible in data sets, no matter how good they are. Like in great admin data, we can see many, many things, but one thing we cannot see are these intangibles, these invisible things. So these are perceptions, attitudes, reasonings that underlie economic behavior and outcomes. High-quality surveys are really key, and so the emphasis is really on the quality here. So they have to be on very large samples, they have to be representative or targeted to specific groups, and what I read here is there are surveys and then there are surveys. So you can do a pretty low-quality survey that won't be very informative, so really the art and the science is in the design, so it has to be interactive, intuitive. The questions have to be asked in a non-tendential way. They have to let people truly express the views and the perceptions that they have. Typically, we always have some experimental components because you can very nicely control the frame and the information that you provide to people and that people see. And they can also be combined with natural experiments, which we're very used to. And here, instead of having as the outcome variable some true economic outcome, the outcomes will be perceptions or beliefs or attitudes. So let me give you some of the results we found over time with these new socioeconomic surveys. So the first result that we found is that belief in the American dream is very important, and beliefs may not be very much in line with reality. So what's the core model here in a few words on a slide? The model that has been proposed in political science and economics as well is that if you believe there's more social mobility and more equal opportunities, then you're actually happy to tolerate more inequality as well. It's very much in line with what Angus was saying. If you view the process as being fair, the process that got you to a given outcome, you're more happy to tolerate inequality of outcomes. But the key is that it's not necessarily more social mobility per se, but rather more perceived social mobility that matters here. And so what we did is to ask people in many countries, one of them was the US, to actually give us their views about social mobility. And the way we asked was using this design of a ladder, where the left ladder shows us the parents' income distribution. So it's a very intuitive way that doesn't require you to ask about quintiles, about probabilities, but just says there's 500 families, which are ranked from the richest 100 at the top rung to the poorest 100 at the bottom rung. And now take 100 kids that are born in these 100 poorest families. What happens to them when they grow up? That will go to the right ladder, classify these 100 kids into each of these rungs. So that is actually a very intuitive way for people to say how much do they think kids can move up or how much do they think kids will stay stuck. And what we find is that, first of all, these beliefs that you have about mobility are very correlated with your desire for redistribution, very much like the model would predict. So what do you see on this slide? Well, the left graph shows you on the x-axis a measure of pessimism, which we define as the probability that you think a kid will stay stuck in the bottom quintile, if it's from the bottom quintile. So the higher that probability, the more you think a kid will just remain in poverty if it's born there. On the y-axis, it's your desired, preferred top tax rate. It's your tax rate on the top 1%. And you can see that people who are more pessimistic want more top tax rates. And this is a pure correlation here, but then we experimentally shifted people's pessimism or optimism about mobility by showing them pessimistic or optimistic information about mobility, and that relation is very much causal too. So when you shift people along the x-axis, you also see this relation. The right graph is the flip side. It's your measure of optimism. It's your measure of how likely you think a kid is to make it from the bottom to the top quintile. And the more you think that's likely, the less top tax rates you want. And here's the gap between, if you want, reality and perceptions. So in the different countries, this is what people think mobility is versus what it actually is. So the way to read this graph is the x-axis shows you the true probability of a kid staying stuck in the bottom quintile. So out of 100 kids, how many will remain there? The y-axis is the average perceived probability in the country. So there's a lot of dispersion, but even the medians would show exactly this relation. So this is not just an artifact of the means. So what you can see is that we have 5 countries here: Sweden, Italy, France, the UK, and the US. The US is quite accurate. It's very close to the 45-degree line. The US, as you notice here, is the least mobile country on average, according to that measure. European countries are actually a bit too pessimistic. So they're too pessimistic about the chance of staying stuck in poverty. Now, what about the chance of making it from rags to riches, this American dream idea? Well, it truly is an American dream because on this graph, you can see again on the x-axis the true probability this time of a kid making it from the bottom to the top quintile. And European countries are slightly too pessimistic again, but relatively mildly. The US is very over-optimistic about the chance of a kid making it to the top. So this idea of the American dream is very salient and not necessarily accurate. Another thing that we noticed is that you probably know this graph from my colleague Raj Chetty and others that shows you the actual probability of moving from the bottom to the top quintile in different states in the US. So there's huge disparities in the US. Some places look very mobile, others much less so. So here darker colors indicate a higher mobility. So lighter colors are the places where kids stay stuck in the bottom quintile. And if I put next to it the perceptions, the right graph, this is for state, the average perception of respondents there. You can see that first, everything's uniformly darker, which is the result that Americans overestimate the American dream. And you can also see that there's almost an inverse correlation. And in fact, that's true. If you plot the ratio of the perceived mobility over the actual mobility, it's very much in places where mobility is low, which is basically the southeast or south, quite Republican states, versus the north, the Midwest, or the West Coast. The relation is actually very strongly negative. So people do not quite understand the lack of American dream, especially in places where there is really very little of it left. Okay, another thing that we found is that who benefits from redistribution matters a lot for how much you want to redistribute. That sounds pretty natural. And one of the things that's been going on in recent years, one of the hypotheses, and what we see also in presidential campaigns and in different countries, is that this idea of immigrants, in the US also minorities, less of an issue perhaps in Europe, immigrants are really coming to make use of the welfare system. They're really the ones benefiting from redistribution, so we don't want to have redistribution. And we've seen a rise in far-right parties that very much thrive on this platform. And so what we did in this project was first to show that, yes, generosity travels less well across national, religious, and ethnic lines. If someone is different from me, I have a reluctance, it seems, as an economic agent, to redistribute to them. Simply making people think about immigrants in an experimental way by asking them questions about immigrants before you ask them questions on redistribution without providing any information actually strongly reduces support for redistribution. It's very stark. And that includes actually private donations to charity. So really, generosity is not traveling very well across these division lines. But perceptions of immigrants are actually quite wrong. So here, for instance, we can see what people think in different countries about the share of immigrants. So that is already absolutely striking to me. yes, we have a sense that people overinflate the share of immigrants, but they absolutely overinflate it dramatically. So here, let's focus on the left chart. Each row is one country, the US, the UK, Sweden, Italy, Germany, and France. The blue diamond is the actual share of immigrants in these countries. So in the US, there's a slight complication whether you include legal or illegal immigrants. We asked about legal. If you included legal, it would be 13.5% according to estimates instead of 10%. The red square is the average perception in the country. And again, if you plotted the median, it wouldn't be very far off. So it is not skewed too much. You can see the gigantic gap between the perceived share of immigrants and the actual share of immigrants. So you can start adding, for instance, second-generation immigrants. You can start adding third-generation immigrants. You will be closing the gap a little bit, but by no means this whole gigantic gap. And then you may say, well, surely enough, educated people would know better, so this has got to be driven by particular groups. But the left graph, which is a little bit harder to read, shows you the average misperception. So now it's pooling all countries together and directly showing you the misperception for the different groups defined by these characteristics. So for instance, the top line is you don't work in a high immigration sector. So there are not many immigrants in your sector. Versus next line, you work in a high immigration sector that's low scale, like meatpacking factories in the US. Or you work in a high immigration sector, but that's very skilled, like Silicon Valley. And you can see down the line all these different characteristics. The thing to take away here is that everybody overestimates the share of immigrants. Yes, there's variation, but really the smallest misperception is around 15, 16 percentage points across all countries. The characteristics of immigrants are also not well understood. So if you look at the perceived share of Muslim immigrants that people have, picking on kind of the non-majority religion. In all these countries, the majority religion are some Christian religion. If you look at the Muslim immigrants share perceived by people, it's also completely overinflated. And another thing I want to point out, if you focus on the right panel here, while there was no difference between left and right-wing respondents in the perceived share of immigrants, both were equally wrong. When it comes to the composition of immigrants perceived, there's a big gap opening. So for instance, if you're a right-wing respondent, you think there are more Muslim immigrants in the country. So your view of reality is very much colored by your political affiliation. The flip side of this is that people also think that more immigrants are poor. So if you look at the share of the poor that people think are immigrants, you can see, again, a gigantic gap. If in the US, for instance, people think that close to 40% of all the poor are immigrants. So if you think of where does one of my tax dollars go, apparently people think it definitely goes to poor immigrants. And that's the case for all other countries too. Okay. Let me skip this. And let me focus on the third topic, which is how news about inequality actually affect people's views. Well, so you can show people experimentally, as in some group sees it, some group does not see it, and you compare what people then think. You can show, for instance, what the inequality cross-sectionally is today. And the way to do it most saliently is to ask them to rank themselves in the income distribution. So here, if people enter their income, I did this as a PhD student, so I entered my MIT stipend at the time, which already put me in the 39th percentile of US households. So it tells you that here 39% of US households earn less than you. And then if you move the slider, you can actually explore the income distribution. The text below adapts, and you can see the different cutoffs. And you can also say what happened over time to inequality. So this slide shows you if inequality had not increased, how well off would you be, or how worse off would you be? And by moving the slider, you realize that everybody except the top would actually be much better off if growth had been equally spread and inequality had not increased. But what happens if you show people that is a bit disappointing. There's no change in demand for redistribution, but what changes is the views of government. So people become much more pessimistic about government, trust the government less, think the government can do less, is less able, less benevolent to do things. So that's a bit a puzzle, perhaps, and perhaps what explains a little bit the lack of demand for redistribution despite rising inequality. And I'll just end with a few facts about policy. So people also misunderstand tax policy. So I did this new project where I'm trying to see what people understand about economic policies in general. And one of the policies is income taxes. And one key thing, for instance, here is that people are very visceral about the top tax rate. We should not increase the top tax rate, or we should increase the top tax rate. But actually, everybody is very confused about where the top tax rate kicks in. So people think the actual threshold is around 170,000. So it kicks in much, much lower than it actually does. It kicks in way higher, almost 3 times higher. So people think many more households are affected by the top tax rate. In line with this, it's actually related to what Angus was saying about who's in the top 1%. If you actually ask people who's in the top 1%, here I've actually grouped together executives, managers, and they tend to be a lot. Of course, they can be across different fields, but if they have executive or managerial roles, this is where they land. Physicians are, exactly as Angus said, around 16% in the top 1%. But people actually overinflate what's, if you want, glamorous professions, for instance, university professors or scientists, and the arts, media, and sports, government, and teachers, which are really small shares, and they underestimate executives, managers, financial professions, physicians very strongly. And another thing I do, which I'll end with, is to let people actually talk. So you can use open-ended questions where you ask people, what should be the goal of a good tax system? Without priming, this comes at the beginning of the survey, without priming one way or the other, what are the considerations that come to people's minds? So ask about the goals, the shortcomings, the main considerations. And then you can do text analysis on this to see what terms jump at you when you think about these issues. And again, very much in line with what Angus said, fair tax comes up. But perhaps sadly, fairness is very much in the eye of the beholder. Fairness means very different things to different people. So if you look at the topics, the topic distribution by political affiliation, ranging from the very dark blue Clinton liberals all the way to the red Trump conservatives, if you group the words into topics that come up in the answers, for instance, of the key considerations, you see expected things, for instance, distributional concerns occur much more on the left, government spending concerns much more on the right, loopholes on the left, and then topics occur across the spectrum. One of them is fairness, and that's why I'm saying fairness is very much in the eye of the beholder. It's not the same thing to different people. So in the interest of time, I'll stop here, but I hope I gave you a bit of a flavor of what you can do with these socioeconomic surveys by trying to get into people's mind, and that perceptions may not always be in line with reality, whether it's about inequality or the policies to address it. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefanie. That was wonderful. I'm going to finish up by taking you back to where Angus began today, or one of his pictures, if this comes out, on the British and the distribution. And keep in mind that the gene has been very flat in 1910. The theme behind this work, which got me interested in this right from the beginning, is the kind of limits, in a sense, to addressing the concerns about wages, low wages and earnings inequality through tax and welfare system alone. And I'll explain why I think that's a key issue as I go through this, especially in the UK, but the same thing would be true here. And that means that we have to think about how we balance tax and benefit policy with other policies, minimum wage, human capital policies we've seen, and policies around regulation and competition, even in the labour market, and they're kind of key here. At the top of the distribution, of course, regulation of companies and rents as well is key there. What we kind of see is that we can study each one of these separately, but we typically don't think about how to balance policies. So let me take you to the UK, and this might come as a surprise. This is over the last 20 years of the UK. This is male weekly earnings, and it's the growth over the 20-year period, more or less the same period where the household family incomes have been very flat on the 90-10. And this is the growth in the earnings distribution by percentile point from the 5th, that's the 5th through up to the 95th. I haven't even put above the 95th because right at the top of the earnings distribution, there's been huge increases over this period in male earnings inequality. This is the growth, the annualized average growth of weekly male earnings over this period. And you can see here it's more or less monotonic. And so those at the bottom have done rather poorly, just like you would see in the US. What's even more tragic in a sense is right at the bottom, there's been real declines in earnings. And so underlying all of that flatness in Gini and 90-10 is a huge change in the inequality in the labor market. And that kind of draws you into what's been going on in the labor market and how come it hasn't shown up, at least in the middle of the distribution of what we'd see to family incomes. Well, the first thing is if you look at male hourly wages, so they don't see this decline at the bottom because we've had a pretty effective rise in the minimum wage with relatively little impact on employment. And right at the bottom, you can see the green line is positive and fairly flat. You still see, of course, the huge rise at the top hourly wages. So what could be the difference there? Well, the key difference has got to be hours of work. And one of the features of the UK distribution, a little bit like the US distribution as well in the labour market, is the fall of attachment, especially among low-wage or low-skill workers. In the UK, that comes through a decline in hours of work, secular decline. This is the proportion working part-time, that's less than 30, among men by quintile of the wage distribution. And it's only among the lowest quintile you see this secular, I can't even see the recession. This is a secular change, a kind of detachment. And it's to do with the structure of work that these workers are doing. And they're becoming, male workers are becoming much more similar to female workers working in services at the bottom of the distribution with much lower hours of work. What does this mean? Of course, it means the minimum wage is going to have a very different kind of effectiveness on earnings to hourly wages, and this is going to be a key point in the balance of policies. But let me first turn you to the family. So what I'm going to do here is do the same picture, green and light green at the bottom. I'm going to do it for women. It looks like a symmetric, perfect match above, if you want. If you look at earnings, female weekly earnings, they've been growing most at the bottom of the distribution in the UK. And hourly wages, in fact, have been a little flatter. And what's been going on there is at the bottom of the distribution, there's been an increase in hours of work, in fact, and a convergence between men and women, in fact, in the labour market. At the top, of course, once you get right above the 90th percentile, everything's going up. And what does that mean? Well, if you think about it, you might think, oh, great, women coming into the labour market, they've solved the problem of household earnings inequality. But it doesn't work like that. And it basically doesn't work like that because of strong assortativeness. And in work we've been doing here with Jim Ziliak, who's here in the audience, just looking at those issues of the rank correlation. If you look in the US, by wages, assortativeness is in fact get stronger over time. And if you put these together, even though there's growth in earnings at the bottom, assortativeness is strong enough that when you look at household earnings inequality, you're back to the same picture. It's not negative at the bottom anymore, so women in the labour market in families have held earnings up where male earnings have declined, in fact, and kept it just above, just in line with inflation, if you want. But there's still a strong monotonicity between what you see in household earnings at the bottom of the distribution and the top. That's a remarkable increase in inequality, actually, and something pretty close to what happened in the US, actually. So what do we do? How do we get to the picture that Angus showed at the beginning? Well, green is the green line here is the growth in household post-tax and transfers total income. So you might not think it, but the UK is an incredibly successful, in this sense at least, in propping up those growth that over this period in growth in this growth in earnings inequality at the bottom, or decline in real earnings at the bottom, to the extent where you can see that it's more or less flat apart from the top. Now look at the 90-10, look at the 90, look at the 10, you can see nothing's happened And that's the picture we saw before. The 90-10 is completely flat once you start the 90s, after this boom in inequality, even in household incomes during the Thatcher period, but also during the change in returns to education. By the way, of course, that's not gone on with the top incomes have just kept going up there, because taxes and transfers don't do anything at the top very much. And so we've had a growth in top 1% share over this period. And as Angus pointed out, the Gini just doesn't pick any of that kind of stuff up. In fact, I was giving a talk in Italy, actually, on this, and I was told before, don't mention Gini. And the reason was because of his associations with Mussolini, actually. And so I learned, put the 90-10 up. But if you look at what the implication is, that over this period there's just a massive increase in the real spending in in-work transfers. Something equivalent to earned income tax credits, much, much more generous in the UK. They prop up family earnings that are low. This is tax credits and equivalents in the UK, going from around less than 10 billion at the beginning of the period up to over 30 billion. What happens in 2012 is there's a change of governments. The Labour Party get elected out in 2010, a new Tory party come in, and their view is this has just got too high. And I'm talking about a Tory government here. What's their solution? The solution is the minimum wage. Then what they do, this is very uncharacteristic of British political history, they shift from tax credits to increases in minimum wage. And they think of them as a substitute, by the way, that all we're doing with tax credits is subsidizing firms and not workers. And so this question of incidence has become absolutely key in the political debate. But if you look at what the implications of that switch in policy is, this is the proposal, they actually enacted, and they haven't changed at all, actually. This is with the latest implementation of the recent budget. This is the declines in income that happen due to the pushback on benefits and tax credits over this period, a massive change at the bottom. So if you were to look at that picture, we'd see a big growth in earnings inequality if this were income inequality if this rolls out. If you look at what the minimum wage changes will do, they're not particularly well targeted to low income families. They're targeted to low hourly wages, and that's typically relatively young singles on low wages. There's a 25 age cutoff, by the way, so it's that group of late 20s singles that get most of the impact. This is done by the impact of the minimum wage as it's come in to quite a generous level. By the way, by 2020, which we're in already, by the middle of this year, we're thinking of minimum wages in the UK at about the same level as Germany and France. So these are quite high levels now. And really what this kind of tells you is that you have to, if you're thinking about relative income inequality and earnings inequality, the way the minimum wage and tax credits act is very different. And it's a kind of key in thinking about the balance. I now think of these as strongly complementary policies that you might, and we have to understand the incidence. By the way, there's not a single good, really credible empirical paper yet finding exact incidence of tax credits in this kind of framework, which is a pretty remarkable comment on us as Labour economists working in public economics. But just the final thought on on how we might think about what's driving this. One remarkable thing is the lack of progression, wage progression, the very low profiles of wages over people's careers. This is women, by the way, in the UK by 3 education groups. I could draw this, and we have. For the US, it looks just the same. By the way, it looks the same, pretty much the same around Europe. At the bottom of the distribution, it's just extremely depressing. And I spent a lot of time with a lot of colleagues, including a paper in Econometric recently, trying to unravel this and remove it. You know, there must be selection, there must be a whole stack of things going on here. At the bottom, it's extremely depressing in the labour market. And people that come into the labour market with low education typically have a very flat profile over their career. And if you think their children also have a relatively flat profile, then you can see the kind of concerns about inequality, I think, are driven by your lifetime profile. It puts a very different take on the way we think of social insurance. People at the bottom in families in the UK will be on tax credits the whole of their lifetime. It's not a matter of insurance, it's almost insurance over your career. So these are kind of key issues, I think, and understanding what's going on here is going to be important. We have made a little bit of progress, and if John was here, by the way, John was double booked. I think he's in the room next door talking about the same thing, probably. But the one thing we found is that, well, there are firms that employ low-educated workers who do extremely well. And so we've been trying to figure out what it is with some work with a bunch of people, including Philippe Aguillon and Rachel Griffith, looking at kind of task data by education, by quality of firms, and good firms with high rents, typically innovative R&D firms with high rents. Workers of low education that are still in them do much better. And in fact, the relative premium is higher for low educated than it is for high educated. A bit of a surprising result. And it doesn't all go away with selection, in fact. In fact, what you find is that there are tasks and skills that low-educated have that are valued by good firms. And they're, as to follow up on Orazio's talk, they're all about soft skills and non-cognitive skills, which are the most, relatively more abundant, of course, among that group. So that's a kind of key, and I think that's where we want to go. We're doing a lot of work in the review on that. So a little bit of summary, and that's it. A depressing finding, there's really little wage progression at low-educated and part-time work, by the way. Part-time work is dominating the work of men and women at the bottom of the distribution, and women when they have young children. Very low returns there. Employment increasing is not enough to move out of poverty. The old idea that we had that the welfare system would get you into work and then you'd run yourself out of poverty, and it's just disappeared, even if it was there. What we're trying to see is whether these profiles have increased over time, and that's a big part of the agenda. What I put down there is some policy options, but I'm not going to spend time on it because I already have, and I realize we're running out of time. But the challenge here, I think, and I've got more excited about this as the data becomes more depressing, the research becomes more exciting, and that is that there are things we really don't understand here, and I should have understood them. I feel I should have understood them. And this interplay between the tax and transfer policy at the bottom and minimum wage and competition policy in the labour market is just, aching to be solved, and that's going to be my objective, at least, during this review. So thanks to you all. Let me thank the other panel members. I think we're out of time, actually. That's apologies for my bad chairmanship. And I think we won't have time for questions. Is that reasonable? This has been videoed, though, and as I said, we're going to put the slides up, and we really like a lot of interaction during the process of this review. So I hope we get it here and in the year or so to come. So thank you very much, and thanks to my panel.